See, that's old world chart.
Yeah. Have to make them so big to keep the water vapor away from the steam engine. It is 1 o'clock. Okay, it is 1 o'clock, so we'll call the meeting to order. Just a reminder for everybody here and not here, the session is being recorded. If you don't wish to be recorded, then I guess you have to go somewhere else. As ever, and in keeping with every other meeting you've been in the last few days, this meeting is under the note well. It is an official meeting of the IETF, and you have to abide by these rules. If you don't know what these rules are, then please do go and familiarize yourself with them because they concern IP and behavior and conduct and how we actually do the official business of the IETF. But hopefully you all are familiar with this and will abide by it. Similarly, note really well not only codes of professional conduct, but also a professional code of personal conduct. We don't tolerate or accept abusive behavior or any kind of upsetting behavior in these meetings. Thankfully, I haven't seen any, but just in case anybody's feeling spicy, please don't. This is a nice club of people who are just trying to do good work, and there's never any need to get personal or upset people or be rude. So don't do that, and we'll all be happy, and the work items will get done faster, and the internet will be a better place. Hi Deb. So just in case anybody does feel upset or there's any bad behavior and you don't want to raise it in the room, do go wherever you want, including us as chairs or Deb Cooley, who's entered the room, who's our responsible AD.
I'm like, where are we going?
Yeah. I'm just letting people know that if ever they feel upset, they can tell somebody. Yeah, quite. So enough of that. Anyway, for
Just to mention,
Yeah.
and the ombuds team, that
Yes.
that's your ultimate
the
resource.
links, the links are in the slides. The ombudsperson team will look after all this sort of stuff. So we joke about it, but it's serious. If you do get upset, we will fix it. For running the meeting, so everybody who's here, please sign into the on-site tool. If for any reason at all you can't do that, scan the QR code at the back, please. It's important to record attendance, but hopefully everybody's on the on-site tool. Obviously, everybody who's on the line is recorded automatically, so you don't need to do anything about that. We did have issues with this in a previous meeting, so please, if you're in the tool, click the wrong button, whatever, please do mute, because the echo problems are horrific. And here, so Chris got in early with this, but I'll ask again, a few more people have filtered in the room. AJ has volunteered. AJ always volunteers. He's great at doing that, but it would be wonderful if he has some help too. So if anybody in the room can assist with the note taking, that'll also be very good. We need to have agreed and high quality notes of these kinds of things. So please do help out. And as a bonus, as I always like to point out, if you take notes, you get to look at the pretty hedgehog, which is cool. Okay, so that's it, I think, unless you can think of anything else. So agenda is as posted. We've made slight adjustments to the timings, but the procession of the meeting tends to make adjustment to timings anyway. So without further ado, if Steve Lasker could come to the mic. For anybody who is new to SCITT, or needs a refresher, we're going to give an overview of what this whole thing is about.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Steve Lasker, and we'll start with next. So our working group charter, this hasn't changed. So it's providing integrity, transparency, and trust, and defining a set of interoperable standards, building blocks for implementers to build integrity, accountability into software supply chain systems to help assure trustworthy operation. And the key there is around that trustworthy. Who do you trust? And that's key because we trust different sources for different scenarios. And that's really a lot of what you'll see come through in many of the SCITT scenarios. Next. So in this working group, we have three main documents so far. There's the architecture, which we're hoping to wrap up. And so that's why you kind of see it's been our priority. And we're trying to trend down the priority, meaning we feeling it's in great shape. Thus, feedback would tell us whether it's in great shape and we need to change the trajectory of our focus. We are transitioning over to the reference API, Scrappy, for the SCITT reference API, to see does it actually help us implement the reference architecture and what issues it would surface back and forth. And we'll talk about that quite a bit today. One of the things that the group has been discussing and debating is while the use cases were extremely important for us to get focus on what we were accomplishing in the working group, there's been various debates around whether use cases should be promoted and go through the whole draft process, or they're a great building block, but we won't carry them forward. We have been discussing bringing the summary of the use cases into the architecture so that there's a reference to those in the official docs so that we know what it is we're trying to solve. So that's been probably the biggest, well, it's one of the debates we've been having. So with that, next. So, well, what does SCITT do, right? We got this nice text. I'm a visual person. I like thinking in pictures. So we have issuers, which are entities of whatever. It could be a machine, could be a user, it could be a company, it could be a project. Anything that there can be an identity about can make a statement about an artifact. I think this software is good. It was built on this environment. Here's the SBOM for this artifact. Here's the VEX for this binary. Here's the people that were involved in a virtual conversation. Here's my support for a virtual conversation to be allowed for distribution. Here's a redaction that says, I no longer want this VCon, my participation in the VCon, to be used for distribution. Those are all statements about a thing that are made over time, and then you can choose whether you trust the issuer of that statement or not. One of the things that we've been having on the thread just today was the idea that multiple statements can be put onto a SCITT instance that are the same statement, and whether they're the same statement by the same issuer and they just register multiple times, or it's different entities making the same or conflicting statements about an artifact. Those are all valid scenarios. So the idea is I can bundle that information together, and then I sign it through the issuer, and then it can get registered on a SCITT instance. So next. Sorry, next.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. So the signed statement, all of that happens before it even gets to SCITT. So now you are registering a signed statement on an instance of a SCITT server, and then there's a notary step that will evaluate the identity of the issuer to decide whether it should accept that. We make the analogy to notaries, it doesn't validate the contract that you're getting notarized is a valid contract, just are the identities who they say they are. So now you can debate around the content and not who the issuers are. That's the main purpose, and there are each SCITT instance can host a set of registration policies that it decides what type of identities it'll allow. We do this, a gym allows me, they don't care what my identity is as long as I pay. Domestic travel, my driver's license is fine. International travel, passports required. So it's just, those are kind of good analogies of thinking about what are the identity types that you want to trust for a particular SCITT instance. And then relying parties can query that information, or they can use the receipts that are given about a registration to decide how they want to process that software or that scenario at that point. Next. How does this come out? We focus on CBOR as our protocol or payloads for how things are shared. So we have some information here on how this is all structured. This has evolved over time, depending on how much you've been watching SCITT over time. So we definitely want to be leveraging existing standards. So we have adopted the CWT claims, and the issuer is captured there, as well as the subject. What is the subject? What is the collection of artifacts that what is the artifact that a collection of statements wants to be referring to? I think it was the correlation ID, if you will. So that goes in the CWT claims. The claims go in the protected header. And then there's some other header parameters depending on what identity you chose. So in this, well, first of all, we have the content type of the statement. So that's what you have there. And then you have, in this case, we have some X509 properties if you're using X509. Next. And then for standard cozy signing, you're signing the protected header and the payload. That's what the signature is based on. There is an unprotected header, which can handle additional metadata, but it is not part of the integrity checking that's in the signature. Next. And the unprotected header is a nice bucket to be able to put additional information to, not just metadata, but when we want to simplify the distribution of these statements, signed statements, the receipts, and the content. So at the end of a registration, you can take the signed statement and put the receipt in the signed statement in the unprotected header. So now you have a single piece of content, a transparent statement that has a reference to the statement, the thing that you were saying in the first place, the SBOM, the VEX, the this is good, whatever you want to put as the payload or a hash of that. And you've got the receipt and the transparent statement all put together. So that's the basic structure that you'll see passed around. Next. Now this one was kind of interesting. I've certainly, it doesn't go in irony that the internet kind of hit some challenges just as people that help form standards of the internet are trying to come to a conference. So everybody wants to talk about the latest security issue or latest challenge. So with SCITT, we often talk about there's multiple vendors or multiple issuers can be making similar statements or conflicting statements. In this case, if I've got Big Co, which is just some random company, they're probably using software from multiple vendors, and each of those vendors can be making and publishing signed statements around their content. Security companies on their instance of a SCITT service can be making statements around software. So for instance, somebody could be saying that maybe I shouldn't be deploying the latest version of CrowdStrike. And it could be a company, or it could be inside the Big Co environment. So we see this all the time. What's the best way to deploy a vulnerability, whether it's human mistake or malicious intent, is to deploy it as an update. So staying the most up to date is not necessarily the most secure. Of course, after you have the vulnerability, now you want to be up to date for the latest. So there's all those semantics, and it couldn't vary on the environment. So anyway, that's kind of what we have here is just with SCITT, you can correlate a collection of statements around a thing over time, and then you can choose which issuers you wish to trust for the statements you want to process and use. Next.
Yeah. I think that's you, isn't it?
Now, when I'm talking about these scenarios of whether I should deploy the VEX or should deploy the software based on the VEX or the SBOM or this is good, with SCITT, we do not have content types that are owned. The content is opaque. So this is where we're looking for various industries to define what is the format for the subject, what is the format of the content that should go in, right? The SBOM various SBOM teams are defining what an SBOM is. Great, you just put it in this payload. We're not part of that decision. We're going to facilitate trustworthy sharing of that information. So that's what's really nice about this, is that it gives you a boundary to put issuers' trust into content, but the ecosystem of all those content providers build on their own. They can provide all of that, they can evolve, and then we can help facilitate trust in that content. So that's it. Next.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Next is the next section. So thanks, Steve, for
Okay,
being
thanks.
perfectly on time. And if we could welcome Henk Burkholz and Roy Williams to the stage, or in whatever order you wish to do this.
Lean on you because they're
Oh,
having trouble standing.
Oh,
Well, it had to happen. I mean,
Yeah, IETF are dangerous. Also, take care. I might be feral. Frothing. Too much soap. Not doing that here. We are doing Cozy and Seaworth, so no soap in sight. Yeah, our recap is we have been working on this for quite some time. That's the data tracker, of course. It felt like an age. It's 2 years. So for 2 years, I think we're in a pretty okay state. We reshuffled the architecture and trimmed down a lot. The architecture was a gravity well of all the things that we wanted to do. We defined receipts completely there, although it's a Cozy item, and we should talk to Cozy people. We started that there, it's not in there anymore, and we will come to all of that. We had a lot of, when I say application user scenarios, we trimmed those down. The use cases, as been highlighted by Steve, are still living in another document, but I think some tightened up excerpts of those would help the reader to get context for the architecture, which is, I guess, our biggest editorial issue that remains up to this day. So in 119, next slide.
Oh.
Huh. This is a weird, there's some, sure, why not? I can do this from memory.
Let me see if I can find
So the one important thing is that we have technical functions, like we sign stuff or we convey items, and there are functions in there that guarantee some correlation of events that happen. So if you register something at a transparency service, at the same time you get a receipt. That is not an atomic function, but it's tightly bound. So these technical functions are now in a diagram, and then there are also roles that execute these functions or have utilization of those functions, and that was a little bit mixed. So let's maybe just move on to the architecture side, that we can look at something instead of the data tracker bar.
this thing.
Yeah, so let's move with that. Okay, so what I highlighted is that the architecture was a gravity well for everything we wanted to do. We scraped that out. So there's now a verifiable data structure ID in the Cozy working group called Cozy Receipts. Receipts are basically proof containers for certain actions or qualities of a verifiable data structure operated on them. So we have inclusion proofs. That's most obvious, the thing we need for SCITT, because when you enter something to transparency service, you want to have a knowledge about that it's in there. So why do that in the first place? Why not just keep the signed statement? Because the key material typically, and the certificate itself has a crypto period. These things expire, and you want sometimes auditability long after the fact. That's a VDS quality, the verifiable data structure quality. Typically, it's a Merkle tree. It can be anything. So I'm falling back to the super hardened Linux-based SQL database that you trust very, very, very much. And if you run that in a TE, it could be a VDS in the end. So it all defined, it depends on your requirements and how you'd sell the implementation. That's not our concern. Then the Cozy working groups, Cozy Receipts, basically tell you what proof is used and expand on the proof. You can add additional proof types. For example, a consistency proof. That would be the next one. In Cozy, we would do it there. We would not use it in SCITT. We would profile it in SCITT. We would pull it in, put all the extra header parameters and content here, And so that is, I think, the main step. And there was an artifact left in the architecture document that is the tag for the cozy receipt, the CBOR tag. That was somehow left over in the architecture that also is now exclusively registered in cozy. So that has moved out. We had a lot of discussions about what a refreshed or new receipt means, because you of course get a receipt when you register a signed statement. You get this receipt back. But what if you need another receipt? Behavior here depends, of course, on the implementation. You could get the exact same receipt back if there's no timestamp in your SCITT profile. And if you're using a deterministic signing function, the key material hasn't changed. Then the receipt that we will get back is the exact same one. This is a very fringy case, typically signature, not deterministic. Sometimes you have profiled it with timestamps. So expect a refreshed receipt to be about the exact same thing, but not identical to the receipt you lost. If you lost the invoice on paper that you get from this hotel when you check out and get another one, it typically says copy on it, right? And there might be even a different date on it. So it is the same thing. You can reimburse their money. You can get it back from your employer most likely, but it is a different receipt about the same statement that I have been staying in some hotel. So that is how this works. Want to add something to that? No. Okay. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And finally, yeah, we have the diagram. We will come to this in the next slide. So I'm skipping that for now. We have made an interesting decision for the use of certification paths for validation in signed statements or corresponding receipts. So in this case, for both of them, certification paths help validation a lot. It might make you a little bit lazy because you don't like look that up yourself, but including them in a signed statement, including them in a receipt helps in a lot of use cases, but they should be optional. How do we deal with that? We are basically thumbprinting the issuing certificate and put the thumbprint mandatory into the protected header of the cozy statements of both signed statements and receipts, and then put the certification path in the unprotected header. You can leave that out, you can prune it out, but it will be registered with that if you put it in the signed statement. So if you pull it out, you can't correlate it. If you see it's missing, it can't validate it anymore in the same way. Also, it is cryptographically bound because the leaf certificate thumbprint is in the protected header. So you have a cryptographic anchor for the certification path. And so it is now, when you process this, up to you. If it's big, okay, well, I scrap it out, move it away. Oh, I need it again. Okay, I lost it, I didn't save it, I get a new receipt with it, and again. So, you know, there's a lot of flexibility in having the certification path in the unprotected header, but you must need some cryptographic anchor for it in the signed immutable statement, and that is the X5T thumbprint of the issuing certificate. I think that was a good compromise. Nobody really hated it. Nobody actually, some people didn't love it, but I think it's compromise and standardization. I think we did a good job there. Hash envelope is something that is spawned in cozy. That is very, very important when you have large payloads. Payloads typically go into the cozy envelope. If you have a 20 gigabyte SBOM and you want to have it registered, sending all this 20 gigabyte to a transparency service like every second minute might not make a lot of sense. So it is okay now to use a so-called cozy, what's it? A hash envelope. Okay, is it all right? Okay, yeah, it's right there. And so what this basically does is it allows for the payload to be a specific payload that is the hash of the actual payload, and that is then the content envelope that goes into the transparency service. That is a new thing in cozy. I think it's now 01. That it has not been adopted yet. Or was there an adoption call in cozy this time? I can't remember. Ori?
Was there an adoption call?
I can't remember either. Yeah,
There was a vote.
So
Yeah.
I want to bring up an unpopular term here because there's a quality feature to the SCITT transparency service that it handles all payload opaque. As cozy has, for example, bytes to be signed, SCITT has bytes to be registered. When you put something into the unprotected header, it will be registered. If you scrape it out afterwards, that's your problem. Deal with it. Now, the opaqueness of this payload is kind of broken when you do hash envelopes. You kind of have to understand that there's content somewhere in the unprotected header that can be a pointer to what the content is. And in some scenarios that could be called a non-opaque payload in the content of SCITT. I'm not entirely sure if that's true. I'm leaning towards that. It's not important to the architecture, but it's important to people who implement it to understand, is it still something that I have to understand all the time? Then it would be a non-opaque payload. Or is it something that I can just use and assume that people will understand it or implement it correctly? And there are opinions about that.
Go ahead, Ori.
Hi, Ori Steele. I think Justin pointed this out in Cozy, so I'm going to give him the credit for this. But if you've got a hash and you're signing the hash, like you better actually go check that that hash is matching the artifact that you're trying to protect.
Which would
so
make
like,
it a non-opaque.
It's non-opaque. Like you
Exactly.
better check the hash.
The consumer at the end. Sorry, the consumer at the end has to validate the hash anyway. So it's not the function of the ledger to validate the content. So at some point, all it's doing is validating the identity, like Steve said, it's a notary. So the end result, the customer still ends up having to validate the content hash anyway.
Further to that point, it seems a tad bit risky to me to leave your URI in an unprotected header. What is the threat model that allows that?
Clarify with your question.
You are placing a piece of tamperable data, which is necessary for validation. How are you, like, what is your threat model? How does that work?
It's a valid question. The question is whether it is the pattern we want to see. The point about the opaque content in this case offers a scenario where a subscription service like anti-malware can sell their feed and prove their time and reference to the content without exposing their material, right? If they were on a charge for it, then potentially the suggestion may be not to put that there, period.
Okay, I guess where I'm going is maybe I'm misunderstanding something. I probably am, but it looks to me like you've got two choices. Either it's opaque and you don't even need the URI, or it's not opaque and it better be the correct URI.
In the case where it's opaque, is the subscription service where it's offered out of band a different way. Whether you need the URI as a query prompt to go and retrieve it off that feed is an interesting question. As to, since you're buying it as a subscription for your company, then basically you're relying on the authentication of that service to retrieve it via that URI. You're right, if it's just the general internet, I agree. It's a threat vector that we have to worry about.
Go ahead.
Can you say your name at the mic for the note taker? Thanks.
Hi, Justin Richer. And since my name was already brought up, thanks, Ori, I figured I should clarify a point that I do think is actually germane to this discussion. The point that I raised from Cozy was specifically about a detached hash, which Merkle trees traditionally are not. In order to validate the data structure, you are calculating the hash of the nodes as you go through. The problem with a detached hash is that you have the hash value sitting as a value in a field somewhere. And if you just check against that value and then don't check that that value actually maps to the thing that it's supposedly pointing to, that's where the problems come in. And this is it largely boils down to a data structure implementation note. Not being deeply familiar with this particular draft, I don't know if that is a concern with this specific data structure. That said, it is something that, generally speaking, when you're doing hashes of hashes, signatures of hashes, blah, 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 you need to point out in the security considerations that if there is an extra step, make sure you absolutely take that extra step, or the security properties that you think you're getting do not actually apply.
Thanks, Jess.
Steve Lasker. So to the question of location, it is optional. So it's more a matter of if you want to be able to get it, you can, or you might decide, I don't want to make it public. The location is basically a hint. In fact, it was called hint at one point. But the idea is that I might have that content already on my machine for another scenario, and you're really matching the hash to that. So by all means, we've just submitted it. Well, I'm sure we'll take feedback and we can consider various pieces.
Right. Question is just what's the failure mode if it's forged?
I'll repeat the question if you want. What was the failure mode if it's forged? If the URL is forged? Well, okay, so that's a good point. It goes back to who is the issuer that is making that statement. But to Justin's point, of course, at final deployment, you should always be comparing the hash. Those are all different steps in the workflow. So.
I think the point he's making here is you could download a 50 gigabyte document with malware, and on your system, you could scan it and default the machine because it was detected as a virus. And that is definitely a concern.
Yep, fair.
Ori.
Actually, I think you pretty much got it at that point. Like, you've these resource identifiers. Before you start, resolving them, make sure you're okay. And as you're resolving them, make sure they're not too big and all your other policy considerations. But at the end of the day, you have to compute a hash from these things and actually confirm that hash matches the signature.
Yes. So there were three other points that Hank didn't make. One was we kind of started off trying to get flexibility around identity, and we discussed DIDs, and we kind of parked that for the time being because we don't have enough confidence in the layer, and we focused on X509 for the largest part. The spinning off of identity for companies and products and so forth, we've also spun into SPICE, and now that's a working group. That'll be this afternoon. The third aspect of SCITT that Steve didn't quite get to is in an X509 case, we have a set of routes that we have to carry around. In the case of browsers, that's 300 routes, and we don't want to create another 300 routes around the system. So moving towards something like SCITT Ledger, that's maintained at the server endpoints, and you just have to trust the ledger in this case to say, hey, if that identity validated the other identity, I believe it.
Coming back to my original point, we are breaking up a principle that we defined at start, that all statements are opaque. In this case, there's disagreement there. It could be interpreted as a non-opaque statement, and that is something we will deal later with when there might be other use cases. So SCITT is not done with the architecture. There will be more profiling in the receipt side and the signed statement side, and then we will figure that out. I don't think it's germane to this document, so just learned, but it is an interesting fact that this was discussed. I think that was a part of the recent changes. So moving on to the next slide, because we have 2 minutes left. There has been a lot of editorial things happening at the hackathon. It was really a hackathon for ID in this case. Hannes went into a fit. I don't know. It was amazing. So 22 new PRs, and there was a lot of approval. We meshed them, they meshed them. I think only 4 of them didn't make the cut. When if I could count correctly, I would see it, but yeah, that's about right. And so there was one thing I was starting with the functions and the roles at the beginning, and maybe nobody was really understanding where I'm leading up to. Verifier role versus relying party role across domains is a nightmare. We are done with verifier. We are doing signature checking, and relying parties do some stuff. Amongst them, mostly also signature checking, okay? We are not using verifiers, just too confusing. Everybody thinks something else, and it was just not worth meandering on that anymore. We are just doing relying party at the moment. If there is a concrete and specific problem with the terminology, please raise an issue. If not, this is done now. So, and analogously, issuers and relying parties are now roles. And there was a lot of discussion if the auditor role is in scope for the SCITT terminology, but this long-term auditability and accountability after the fact was basically the first line when we chartered. It was on every slide. So it felt wrong to exclude the specific relying party, that's the auditor, from the text. That's why it's still there. There are some there will be, again, these small use cases, they will pick up on it, at least one of them. So it is not the most vital role for the concept itself, but I think it's a very vital role for someone who wants to maintain a transparency service. That's why it's in there. It's more like, I want to say, don't throw stones at me, it's more a storytelling device to understand where and why this document exists, then it's a technical necessity. So that's, would you agree with that? Okay, fine, thank you. Next slide, please. So we stabilized the diagram. Unfortunately, it doesn't read well on this tiny screen. So next slide, please. Unfortunately, this doesn't read well on this screen. So thank you, Steve. Next slide, please. Well, it doesn't look like it. This is the same diagram, okay? But this is hopefully readable from everybody in the room here right now. The IDs are like, you know, this is wrong perspective. So yeah, we now have still the artifact in this diagram. An artifact in the first use case is typically a software component. As we are agnostic to the use cases long term, it can be a car, okay? In our certain charter scope right now, it's software or statements about software. Again, sorry. And the statements are derived about the software. For example, there can be a vulnerability, and you could, for example, take the NVD statement about that vulnerability and register that. So that is a statement about an artifact, taking into account that the NVD augments CVE statements, and they're really, really in the backlog. Maybe I'll not do that today. But okay, so the rest of the diagram typically is staying the same. We annotated differently. We have two annotated edges. Typically, all edges should be annotated, but we annotated the signing and the signature checking edges here to really make sure that the identity document, which is called credential now, is applied and its corresponding key material is applied. So issuers use the credential to sign statements, and later, if a transparent statement has signature checked, then you also use the COSI procedure. And at the moment, we are strictly with the signed statement limited to COSI sign 1 to make it simple and easy. Also, the diagram now reflects that you can have A, multiple transparency services, and B, multiple receipts from those. In this diagram, it's one receipt from each transparency service about the same statement, but different receipts, different authorities that keeping track of it. You can have multiple receipts from the same transparency service. We covered that. They might look the same, probably they don't. Again, Steve already explained, if you collapse them, they become the treat. That is the transparent statement that you typically deal with. So that diagram still is not perfect, but it will never be perfect, but I think it's good enough for now. If you think more edges should be annotated and it's not clear what they mean, please file an issue. We don't want to overload the diagram anymore, but I think this is, after we had churned this a lot, we have to cut it off at some point. We are at the opinion good enough. File issues or come to the mic if you don't think that's the case.
File issues because we have no time.
Yeah, okay, maybe there's no time for the mic. Okay, ignore listen to the chairs, not to me. Next slide, please. And that's it.
That's it.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Let's see if I can do this. So briefly putting my chair hat aside, just in case I say anything untoward. I'm going to do a little bit about Scrappy. So for people who don't know, Scrappy is our ID for the REST API that allows you to actually interact with, create the wonderful things that Henk was just showing on that diagram. And just as a statement of fact, the current draft has this set of interfaces. So posting getting receipts, getting signed statements, and so on. And so what I wanted to do at the hackathon was to make sure that Scrappy kind of worked, and to make sure that the thing that worked accurately and faithfully implemented the architecture, and that it was usable. So I thought, a good way of doing that would be to go through all of the open issues and knock them all off. And if we managed to knock them all off and I had a working program at the end of it, that felt like a good way of doing things. And when I took a look at the map of these things, there are a couple of them are just sort of already done, whatever. Of the ones that are interesting, 3 out of the 4 were concerned with the issuer workflow, and only one of them was to do with verification. So, just looking to prioritize. Had a look at that and decided to do a hackathon hack on asynchronous issuance, and if that works, then all of these issues pretty much can be closed. So it felt like a good thing to do. And actually, I will go back one to use my time. So end-to-end workflow, again, there's a sort of use case version of what Hank just showed. Start with an artifact, might be the piece of software, it might be a VEX or an SBOM, or it could be a PDF with one of these vendor attestation forms that we did a few IETFs ago. That becomes a statement. It's somehow signed either with remote signing services, which Corey and some of the DigiCert crew also did in the hackathon, or you can locally sign it. That's all fine. That becomes a signed statement. It then goes into the transparency service, and at the far end of it, if everything goes well, you get a transparent statement out the end, and now you've got your nice, durable, long-term accountable proof of whatever this thing is that's entered your software supply chain. And the good news is it does work. And we managed to prove a few things about the issuer workflow in terms of interoperability. I appreciate PyCozy and GoCozy interoperating may or may not be impressive, but it's certainly good that they do. And we also managed to prove out multiple vendors working with these libraries, exchanging things, sign statements and Cozy Sign 1 format, all working. And as a bonus, got a little run out for this new Cozy hashed envelope as a payload type, which also seemed to work. And closed out the issues. So I'm just going to hold this now. So just very briefly, because we've talked about this at length now, I take my artifact, I hash it, I wait for meet echo to catch up. Come on. No, meet echo is very unhappy.
It's still hashing.
Yeah.
It's verified.
It's the 80 gigabyte file. Let's see what's going on with this. I'm going to refresh my browser. So the slides are obviously available on Data Tracker. I don't need to labor this too badly, but just to show the Cozy that comes out of it, the Seaball that comes out of it, is all, looks the right sort of shape and is coming along. So far so good. The issuer role is done. I've just refreshed my screen. If you could press buttons, Chris, that might make the thing work. So the issuer workflow is fine. So where we've landed now, and if people have been watching the list, Roy Williams has also done quite a. Here we go. Let's keep pressing. And again. Next slide, please. There we go. One more. Let's do this. So, so the relying party, if we assume that goes through, workflow is now the one that needs much more attention and does definitely need attention, because what we have right now is not strictly implementable. So we have several resolvers. We have the optional URN, which is based on the hash of statement. This feels nice, but it falls foul of a few problems. So notably, the class of problems where you register the same statement against multiple subjects, and the issue that was brought up earlier that you might register the same statement twice in time for some reason. Maybe you forgot, maybe you've got multi-threaded software that doesn't talk to each other, whatever. So having a single thing based on an immutable property of the statement doesn't necessarily give us the flexibility we need in a system that's supposed to be coding also for time and also for identity. So we need to do a bit of work there. And then we've got these resolvers for finding statements, signed statements and receipts based on that ID. So these resolvers are a good starting point, but probably need to be improved a little bit. So next slide, please. So rather than sort of starting there and seeing what we can do with it, let's go back to the use case and see how we solve the use case. So two main questions: do the APIs work? Kind of, but not really. Do they solve a problem? So what does a reasonable relying party have in their hands when they want to check a software artifact? And what is it they want to check? Because a lot of the crypto involved here kind of assumes that you have access to things like signed statements or receipts alongside the thing you're checking. And in much of our experience of building systems like this, that actually isn't the case. It's much more likely that you find something, so you click a button, it's much more likely that you'll find something under a rock and want to check with the transparency service that it is the right thing. And going back to the earlier presentations, the right thing in what we're trying to solve for with SCITT might mean, yes, this was valid, but it's not the latest one. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's just a complete hack or you've got the wrong file. So this issue of hash checking and whatever is only the first part of the story. Slide, please. So with that question, and also the question of the individual hash about the statement, the other thing I can't do with the locators as written is things like, well, okay, I've got this piece of software and I found the receipt for that, but I also need the VEX, SALSA conformance statements, things like that, based on the payload or the subject or something. And this is the can of worms I'm about to open once Roy's spoken.
So the can of worms that John's getting to is for specific verticals there.
Roy, can you say your name at the mic?
Roy Williams, Microsoft. So the can of worms that John's bringing forward here gets to a basic functionality level of what we want to do in SCITT, but doesn't address, the specific verticals will have different ways of doing this. If it's software bills and materials, the SWID or the SBOM ID will be the key for people to look up things, but that's a specific instance of a vertical on top of SCITT. So what we're talking to here is what basic functionality we think belongs in the generic layer, and that the specific for specific markets.
Yep, absolutely. That's the thorny thing, is it's kind of easy to solve the specific problems in a specific case, but we're trying absolutely not to do that. Oh, sorry, AJ.
I'll try to keep it quick and also write notes about myself. I don't know if it's in the scope of SCITT, but it sounds like re-subject. The more we talk about this, and if we're talking about hashes, there's some amount of fuzziness around what an artifact is in a signed statement that we're talking about, or the kind of statement we're making. And I don't know if this is really area work for this area of this work group, but maybe we need to figure out a way of talking about the different options for identifying things at a confidence level. But I don't think that's in the scope of this work group at all. And that's something that kind of needs to be pluggable in this API. I don't know what people's perspective are on that, and I will mute and I'll try to summarize my own comment.
Steve Lasker. So yeah, AJ, I mean, this is what I was referring to earlier, where the subject is open for the industry, right? We were talking about GS1 for barcodes. The first 3 characters are for the vendor, and they own the rest. There's SWIDs, there's VIN numbers. Every industry has a way to define their identifiers, and SCITT, being generic, says you do with it what you want. It's up to each industry to decide. So that's really by intent is not for us to define each one. It's to give them a place to put their definition of how they do identifiers.
Great. So yeah, so I guess my slide has been narrated by the queue. So how do we find this stuff in a useful way? Slide, please. There we go. So a suggestion, because I didn't want to come with just problems. To be clear, the work that I did on the hackathon weekend does prove that verification works, but only in a very limited practical set of circumstances where you're delivered the entire bundle of everything all at once. And again, in some cases that will be the case, but in many other cases it won't be. And of course, as time passes, even if you were delivered the entire bundle of things, your trust in that will erode, and you'll need to go back and check. So we need some kind of locator. So my suggestion here, this is the slide that really made me want to take my hat off, but it is a suggestion, is to constrain location to issuer and subject. These are things that we understand and are defined in the header. There has been discussion about locating by anything in the headers, which as an API guy, I'm perfectly happy with, but as a designing a scalable protocol with a document that's going to finish anytime this century, I'm not really in favor of. To put my chair hat back on briefly to say we need to get the work finished. And I think we can finish our current charter with that restriction. With one note that I think locating by hash is also really valuable. So if we were to change the identifier for practical reasons, I'd want to put that back in. But that's it. I don't think it's necessary to spread the scope. The other thing is, what does it return? So if we send in a map of possibly an identifier, a issuer and a subject, I'm suggesting it should return transparent statements. This is possibly, again, controversial because that would rely on the optional characteristic of the architecture that some auxiliary service in the transparency service is storing the statements at all. It doesn't have to. And so we could take that in a couple of directions. We could either say it's all or nothing, either that auxiliary service exists and this works, or it doesn't and you can't call this function. That would work. That's perfectly fine. Or we can take discussions to issues and discussions on the list that it might return something else, like just the receipt or whatever. And there you go. That's kind of it. So if we're able to come to an agreement or a rough consensus on what to search by, issue and subject I think works well, because if you've got an artifact in your hand and you get its receipt, you now know its subject and you can search every subject. Or if you're looking for generalized statements about the vendor of your software, you've got the issuer, so you can search for everything on the issuer. So this seems to solve the practical problem. In Roy's shaking his head, but seems to go far enough for me. Roy can explain why it doesn't. And there we go. And then we'd be able to write that, test it end to end, and see what happens. So this is, I think, the key area. The good news is Scrappy, to a large degree, does work. We need to formalize the polling for asynchronous registration. That's a thing that we haven't formalized, but it's trivial. There's stuff about rate limiting and access controls, which are, I wouldn't say trivial, they're important to get right, but they're easy to solve because any practical implementation would just make obvious choices. So the one sticky thing to really go over, I think, is this. And if you hit the slide, I think that's the end. So, yeah. So if there's no worms to be eaten in the audience, we'll move on to, this says John/Ori, but this should be Steve, I think.
Oh, that's an updated slide.
Okay.
So, so the hackathon was pretty active. There was several different teams, and as we were originally focused on the architecture in previous meetings, there was a lot of discussions on a document, right, with drawings. And in this case, it's nice to be getting to the point where we're validating things with actual code. So there was, we mentioned draft 7 here, but with all the feedback from the Hannes Blitz, we did issue a draft 8 on Monday to account for all of the updates that we brought in. So thank you, Hannes. So then we, worked on to address the Scrappy. John did a really good recap of some of the things that came out of that. And the other part was, we've had a bunch of groups working on SCITT that were part of it from the beginning, but we had this wonderful person come up in Brisbane and going, SCITT is really cool. And we all looked at each other like, who is that? So Thomas from Strahd had done a bunch of work with VCons. So it was great to get an external group, although, granted they're at IETF, they weren't part of the original conversations. So they were able to take a look at SCITT and implement it and make it part of VCons. So next. Oh, and then actually, what I don't know if it came through in that whole thing was they were actually doing VCon signing with DigiCert. So there was a remote signing aspect as well. So there was a number of great validations being brought in to make sure the end-to-end experience worked in what would be real world scenarios. So lots of PRs and for the SCITT issuer roles, so that there was lots of discussions there around how do we align the terminology for common terms as people that read lots of different drafts and not have to do the context switch around what does this term mean in this draft versus something else. So that's all that I think we've been discussing all of this, so I don't have to recap it anymore. We talked about the VCon stuff, so that's great. Next. We talked about the search stuff. So, it's, maybe we should put the hackathon report at the beginning, but anyway, because what you're seeing in the presentation is a lot of what's been developing over time. More QA on Cozy and what was the other one on that? Sorry. Yeah, and
the GitHub action was the thing I didn't mention.
Is what? Oh yeah. So sorry, I was checking for that. So John was reminding me we have multiple SCITT GitHub actions now too, so it can be automated in your supply chain. We did one at Data Trails, and then the DigiCert did one as well for remote signing. So that really helps validate the scenarios and provide tooling for others to incorporate into their workflows. We'll get those published to the marketplace, so they're generally consumable, not just by knowing what the GitHub repo is. So that was cool. Next. So as I mentioned, some of us were more impacted by others getting here. I had the person at the border ask me, so what are you doing in Canada, so on and so forth, going to a meeting, IETF, what is IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, and his immediate response is like, oh, you guys have a lot to talk about. Yes, so when you impact the average person in mass like that, it kind of brings a lot of focus. So Ori was doing a really cool hack, which I want to make sure I give it justice, but the point is what we were talking before is, who's making the decision on what to apply and what to make a decision on. So, and this one was an interesting one, and when I say this one, I'm referring to the Thursday night CrowdStrike impact. So it's interesting, Thursday night going to Friday on a weekend also. So there's lots of interesting questions that come up. But if I understand right, keeping up, it wasn't even necessarily software, but the signature file. So it wasn't a package update that got brought in, that I'm getting the latest package update. It wasn't a, quote, software update per se, but the signature update, all of which has the same end result. Is I was trying to be latest to be secure and didn't work out so well. So now the question is, well, all right, what is that flow? And everybody's got opinions on the internet around this, and it's great to see so much focus to it. But it's also a lot of the questions of like, who do you trust and for what and why? Because the opposite thing can happen here as well, is I can make you think there's a security update that you should force, or I can make you think you shouldn't update because I found an exploit in this software. But I don't want you to update to the version that patches the thing that I've got exploited. So it really comes down to who do you trust and can you trust the decisions being applied? There's also scenarios where the fix might be worse than the problem in the first place. I joke about, being launching stuff into space with this Acme rocket scenario I talk about. Living in Seattle, there's a lot of companies that are doing space work, so it's a real world thing. They are already running in very secure environments. If I apply a latest patch, that could impact some other scenarios that something else goes at risk and it doesn't launch or it blows up, or whatever the impact is, literally. So we need to get better as an industry about when to apply things and being able to associate trust in those decisions, and deploying policy that depends on that is important. And that's what Ori was basically hacking together here is, am I trying to patch the machine with an identity that's trustable, or am I trying to apply another exploit that gets the blue screen to come back so that my malicious code will actually run? But we need to just get better as an industry around associating identity, creating policies around who I should trust for which environment, so that we can really continue to automate these workflows in a secure way.
Okay.
So
before we go to the next one, let AJ in.
Yeah, but I also want to make sure I also point out, in typical Ori fashion, this is not something he's fully tested. He put together a good idea. I think it's why don't execute this code. So it's an example. It is definitely a hack from the hackathon. So AJ, go ahead.
Yeah, this is very cool, and I like it. I can discuss this later on if it's not the appropriate time, but if we considered adding to the use cases using SCITT transparency services, I mean, you could talk about this being a form of change management or operational. This came up in Slack once before, but this isn't really, last I looked in the use cases, really reflected. It doesn't belong in the architecture. Is that something we want to add, since this seems to have beyond just the CrowdStrike example? And I'm sure this will be the last one of its kind of situation, which is total not BS.
I'm sure we'll get it.
Is that worth doing? Adding it to the use cases? More generalized?
I would suggest we're not fulfilling our first use case in the charter if we don't do that.
Okay. I can make an issue and add it.
Yeah. No, it's whether we have to add it to the use cases document, given that last time we decided the use cases document didn't need to be official. That's more of a process question, but yeah, definitely this kind of use case, similar to like if you download a data file that affects an interpreted, like a JVM, right? Your JVM could be perfect, but the bytecode is broken. That's still broken software supply chain. Yeah. So yeah, if AJ, if you don't think this is well represented, then that's a great catch. We should represent that.
I'll also just add to that, AJ, is one of the things I think it was Hank was suggesting is whether we bring the use case forward or not, is we should probably put a summary in the architecture document that references them. So if we think that is a good example of applying updates is one that we should apply, put in at least in the architecture, if not in the use cases document, I would definitely say yes to that. So I think that was it, or was there more?
No,
but wait, there's more. Oh, yes. So just highlighting the VCon scenarios. So the interesting thing, the other one that's interesting about VCons is this is also around redaction and the right to define, how my data is being used. So with virtual conversations, there's multiple parties involved in a virtual conversation. And initially, they must be agreeing to that conversation to be shared for whatever the training purposes or sales purposes or whatever. This is every time we've been on a call with customer service and we hear that message, this call is being recorded for training purposes or whatever the use case is, you are consenting to that. Whether you hang up or you press a button that says I don't consent to it, or later on where I no longer want that to be shared because I didn't know it was being, whatever the reasons are. I don't want to get into the thousands of reasons that it should be shared in the first place. I don't want it to be shared later. There's this communication that I want to be able to state, I no longer want my information to be shared in this way. Relying parties of that information by contract, by using VCons in this scenario, must check, are the parties still agreeing to share? So they have to check on a regular basis if all of the parties of that VCon still want their information to be shared. And if there's a note placed in a SCITT that's recorded at a certain time, that's non-disputable, says, I want my information to no longer be shared, all those consuming parties must acknowledge that they've received it. If they don't, they're in violation. If they acknowledge they received it and they're redacting it and they don't, they're still responsible. So I believe we still have in the architecture a wording that says SCITT doesn't stop bad people from doing bad things, but it makes it transparent what they do. So SCITT is enabling the sharing of information with VCons and effectively the redaction of that as well. So that was a pretty cool scenario. Next. And just there's a quick overview of the architecture of the conserver and the transparency service interaction. So it's been a fun validation of what we've been doing with SCITT. So that's been cool. And I definitely hand off to the VCon team, which I don't want to try to take their thunder of any questions. So some of them are here as well. And yes, so fun people having fun times at a hackathon on a weekend. So not quite all of it. Oh yeah, well, whoever's taking the picture and
At the very least, Hank
was, yeah, where
involved,
was
but
Hank?
had
Hank
gone
took the
away.
picture.
Yeah.
Hank
Hank,
was the
anyway,
photographer.
there's. Got it. So anyway, and for AJ and others that were working remotely, we always appreciate the participation and the input. So thank you. I think that was it. Oh, so next chairs.
Yep.
Do you want to do the secretary thing?
Oh, you
So the chairs are interested if anyone wants to become secretary. So that really involves making sure the minutes get out and managing the mailing list. Mailing list management for this working group is really a lightweight job at this point. So it's really about making sure minutes and that kind of stuff happen. So if you're interested in that, come see the chairs.
Yep, thank you. So beyond that, obviously, hopefully everybody is enjoying the GitHub workflow that we're using and that the authors are using. That's largely responsible for the low volume of email list traffic. So it works for the authors. It works for me as a chair. I can keep up with that and see it. But if anybody does have concerns or suggestions about better use of the mailing list, we've taken those on board before, and I think it seems to be working. But suggestions are always welcome, and we could adjust that. And obviously, a secretary would help if we were to change that in any way. Okay, so typical next steps is what are we going to do with our documents? The development of 08 is positive. As Hank says, it seems like ages, but it's not actually too bad. But does feel like it's coming time to try to draw these last couple of threads to a conclusion. So Scrappy, clearly we've identified as pretty early. There's only probably one actual implementation and a handful of client implementations of that. So no need to jump on Scrappy, but definitely looking for whether we're ready to move to a working group last call soon. I wouldn't say now because there are still 3 issues open, but is there any concern in the room about moving forward with 08, polishing off the last bits and then feeling like we're ready to make that last call? Yeah, do I have to do an electronic show of hands? I can do that.
I'd like to. I'd like to come to the mic. AJ would just.
Yeah. Go, AJ.
My computer hung. Do you want to do the call and then I can comment after? Up to you.
I'd
all.
actually prefer comments first. I'd like people to go to the mic if they have any kind of comments, and then after we've had the discussion to do a.
Yay. I'll rejoin the queue as the part of a very deep, long queue. I think there's been a lot of progress made. I think particularly some of the feedback from Michael Richardson about the organization. And I know that Steve has pointed out parts of it in relocating the use cases into the architecture, or at least some high level concepts that was identified. I still don't really understand what the story will be, to go back to gaps that are really not known, of how we're going to handle profiling things and this call from Michael Richardson around there's a distinction between architecture and protocol, and just slapping a protocol section to the architecture document, I do not think will help things. I think that's a little bit more than let's polish off the last remaining issues off of '08. I see you laughing, John. I apologize. I'm just going to call it out. Sorry. There's still a lot to be done is my take. I will say the same thing if a working group last call goes. I apologize.
I'm sure AJ wrote that note down, so noted.
Yeah. Are you? Oh no. Okay. Does this negate the need for a show of hands?
Well, I think we should still do it.
Okay. So,
Are you writing it or am I?
I've done it.
Oh,
Yeah. So yeah, show of hands is up. We'll give a moment. I don't know if we just need to have a majority of participants registered. I've noticed, by the way, on the on the attendee list on the chat, there are several duplicate people, so don't be surprised when it's not actually 68 votes. We'll
Numbers aren't really moving at this point.
no, okay, the numbers have stopped moving, so we'll call it there. I mean, I would interpret the high number of yeses as confidence that people can get those issues fixed rather than saying we should necessarily do it right now. But we'll take learned comments from Deb Cooley and Hannes Schifferling.
So you can always ask for early reviews too. It looks like you've done that in some cases for HTTP, but you can do it for sector review, early review as well.
Right.
Anything you think is appropriate, you can ask for, right? So IoT, DNS, whatever applies. Sometimes they're useful.
I'm gonna end it. Yeah.
Just like having the
I
numbers
can
on the
I can
screen
do
if we could
I can do a sector review. So there's obviously
Hey,
there's
Hannes,
some
can you
open
say your
issues.
name at the mic?
Test, Hannes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So there are obviously some open issues. So maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a chance to do an interim meeting after the vacation, summer vacation, and then sort of like work through those open issues and the corresponding PRs, and then see how it looks like. Obviously, the document is like, my reading is very close. It's good. It's a good document, well written. So they're really sort of fine tuning. So definitely looks very good. But I don't know if that discussion that John has been talking about, whether that should be covered in the document, in the architecture document. I think it would probably be useful to talk a little bit about like how do entities actually look up the stuff and get the process kicked off. That type of things I'm probably missing.
Hi, this is Henk. I think Working Group Last Call is an excellent tool to focus eyes on this, as we are not even actually sure if we want to have the use case abstracts in there. A working group call could like say, hey, this works perfectly fine. Keep it as is. And we would save a lot of hassle and work. So I don't think that a working group last call has to win something in the first round. It gains a lot of information and UI sometimes, and I think it's a valuable tool, and that's why I was voting yes. Because humming, I don't know, I want to hum again.
I mean, as I look at the numbers, right? I mean, I'm going to ignore the no opinions. I mean, there was 14 yes to 3 no. So the consensus for those who had an opinion on, is it ready, leaned more towards we're very close than not. Honest, I mean, you brought up a good point. So that's something to consider. Feels like something that could be taken care of in short order, but
So, hey, AJ, do you want to make your point as Deb approaches the mic?
No point. More like typically when that question is asked, one of the other poll questions is how many people have read any of the drafts or the most recent version of the drafts that are being polled against.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
It doesn't hurt to do working group last call. There's no limit on the number of them that you can have, right? Just do it.
Right.
And you'll get more reviews because you'll be in working group last call. So just, I mean, there's no downside.
Perfect. Good. But absolutely right. Before we do that and get loads more reviews, who has actually already read the document before they entered this room today? That's actually that's a decent set actually.
I think hands. I mean, you know, I counted at least, you know, kind of 8, 10. So.
Yeah.
I've seen documents advance with less reads than the number of hands that were up right now. So
Perfect. So let's not jinx anything, but it feels like people are at least confident. And that was it for those. So secretary calls already been made. So any agenda hacking, any AOB, anybody not heard earlier in the discussions who now wants to take this this time? No, well, maybe we can get some of our lives back then.
I don't quit that early.
Oh no, we've got one.
I got all the time in the world. I spend all night watching all of you Vancouver. It's fantastic. What are we going to do about profiling and protocol outside of the architecture? So if we finish these other things, we have to kind of address the elephant in the room and the charter. Are we going to talk about that in the mailing list or somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, the charter stuff definitely has to be on the mailing list and in all sorts of places. I think there is a degree of feeling that we're very close to solving the first use case. We're seeing a lot of other use cases, you know, writing code and actually benefiting. So moving on with the charter to support some of those adjacent things feels like a very possible thing, but obviously we need to finish the first one first. So to your other point, that maybe Henk is about to address, yeah, we obviously need to have all of the appropriate sections appropriately finished. There's not, if any impression is given, then it is not meant that's not an issue. It's just, it's a known thing that we need to get eyes on and get text written. So I don't know at the moment, but yeah, let's take that to the mailing list and see who's capable and willing to solve that problem. Henk?
Yeah, this is Henk at the mic as a contributor. So when I would think about profiling, which I assume is constraining the range of existing CDDL or extending it, and that's obvious that when you're talking about the messages, I wouldn't even know what profiling a protocol means in this context. I'm not entirely sure. We can add a sentence that says, where there is this extension points in our structures, there's extensibility. So water is wet, sure, we can write that. That's not a problem. But when we want to have more than profiling, what profiling is have a meaning here that I'm unaware of, we must add that, I guess. But I don't think it's an issue.
AJ?
So people outside of this meeting and on list ask or talk about I use PGP. How will that work? I point that out as an identifier system, or sorry, a signing system, because that's not really supported by X509 and notionally cozy signing implementations that are alluded to. And one of the open issues, or maybe it was one of the ones closed, was what are examples of discovery and identity mechanisms? There are these high level things that we talk about in understandably high level architectural terms. If it's not profiling or another word, someone is going to have to work through, especially we want for these ambitious high level use cases, how you're going to interoperably have different signing mechanisms and different identifier mechanisms, different discovery mechanisms that reflect this architecture. I'm less preferential about the noun that describes that, but where is that going to occur? Because if we say mission accomplished, and I mean that in the most ha-ha, ironic, sarcastic sense, just for the record, not my opinion of where it came from, we're going to have to talk about how that's going to work for people who want to implement. Like, I love the GitHub Action prototypes, but those are fairly specific to the people who are implementing a certain thing. And then the other people in the room, I would assume, would ask, how am I going to implement this short, medium, long term to be interoperable with many of the software systems, a lot of the analysis systems, the identifier systems? Maybe that isn't meant to be done in this work group, but like, I assume that there's much more expansive work that doesn't belong in the architecture for the different flavors of doing this. And it's not clear to me how that's going to work. And if we don't do it, we can let implementers like me flounder. This is one of been my key problems in understanding how to write my own implementations to share with people beyond a hackathon. That's it.
Roy?
Roy Williams, Microsoft. To AJ's point, in the case for software supply chain, a lot of the document formats and the behaviors are being defined by working groups working with the US government, the SBOMs, the VEC statements, and so forth. So the interoperability at those document levels are outside of SCITT. The value we're adding for notarization and identity is a building block that's generic. The interoperability for documents and everything else are over and above those. So that's a dangerous thing to try and say, hey, we're going to standardize and generate interoperability on. The interoperability level at COSI and CBOR and countersigning is what we need to test.
Hi, this is Hank again. So now I get the question better, I think, AJ. Two building blocks, sign statements and receipts in architecture, which is unusual for an architecture, but it is you can't circumvent it. It is baked into it, so it's there. That's okay to be there. If a reference API, the R in Scrappy is not REST. It's a reference API is an example how to do a full feature set when you have nothing. We start at zero, where we start how we do this. Excellent. If you have an existing solution, you cram, for example, receipt production into your existing solution. That's where our interoperability from the architecture comes from. That's the great cool thing, I think. And then there's this small tiny thing that people want the SBOMs and where supply my software are not thing, which we actually want to solve. So there is a third level document in my mind that ties it all together, that tells the story of an SBOM that got some CSV, CVs, and then a VEX, and the VEX was just a firewall rule. And that's just very sad VEX, but it still makes it not affected. And now you're good, so to speak, right? And so that story has to be solved somehow with the other two documents. And that storytelling could be a guidance document done in SCITT, I think. So that's just one option. I'm putting this out here, let it simmer, but I think that would address the marketing problem we have, right? So now all these cool things that I want to do with it. So yeah, so telling how that works, not inventing the query language or anything like that. That's API stuff, but the story, how to store the statements, give exemplary issue and subjects, and how they conflict and how to decide that, and make a good story, a guidance document, how to use it in the end, I think would be helpful.
Mike Burak here. Hank is obviously taller than me. Germans. No, I'm going to echo Roy quite a bit. I think we've got a lot of the building blocks we need, and if we try to push down into like the details of what's going in and some of those other items, those honestly are better served elsewhere. If we try to boil all of this in one doc, we will never wind up with interoperability. We'll wind up like other working groups and other SDOs like the DID working group with things that look interoperable but aren't, right? And we want to avoid that problem here.
AJ?
I understand what Hank said, and I'm more than happy to work on a guidance document. I think it kind of needs to happen, and I don't disagree with what Roy or Mike said. I just was asking. I don't want to do that in the current documents. I think the documents kind of have to point out where the circle begins or ends around the giant scope of work and the little circles inside of it where they'll go. And if that's not even in this working group or only a part of it belongs to this working group, I'm fine being told that. It's just, I would say it's not clear how to get more implementations of a TS and clients that are getting used beyond the very few that we know of.
So you forced me to drag out your charter.
Yep.
There's no guidance document in your charter, just saying.
Good.
You have a lot of stuff in your charter. It's a very long charter. That doesn't shock me, actually. 32 documents, Hank, 32 documents. Not here, by the way. So you do have a lot of stuff in the charter that you could work on. So I guess you could redo a charter if you wanted to. I don't know that I would recommend that because it takes a long time and it's pretty much a pain and you know what. So I would take a look at the charter and see what you can pick off and do something. And you don't make massive documents. Lots of little documents are better as long as they're not all normative references of each other, like another working group we know. So, or two working groups we know. Yeah. So don't do that. But you have plenty of work in your charter to do.
Good. Yeah, thanks, Deb. So sounds, hopefully that was kind of conclusive. It sounded like we came to some kind of a way forward or a set of ways forward for the concern raised. So yeah, I think, are we?
Any other business?
Last final call. We're calling it done. Well, thank you. Hang on, I can thank you officially for remote members too. No, I can't because the slides. It's crashed again. I don't know. There would be a slide that said thank you. So thank you, and have a nice rest of the day. So.
Hey, how are you?
Hello, how you doing? I was looking for you in Brisbane.
Oh,
Which I could understand.